You've been the Environment Minister in Sweden for over 2 years now. What motivates you? Is it the urgency of the climate crisis that motivates you? What's driving you?
I definitely say it is the urgency. And it kind of creates also a difference in contrast to other political areas. Of course, there's urgency in quite a lot of difficulties and challenges that society is facing today. But when it comes to climate, I think it's so unique in that sense that it requires to take care of that urgency and the fact that we're not keeping up with the pace we need to have, but also the fact that it requires quite a lot of bold action. And in a lot of the areas that I work within the negotiations or within the national politics as well, it's quite an exciting part of politics. There's a lot of movement, a lot of shifts going on, and specifically also being quite young, that was also something I thought about, that I can't actually do this in 15 years, because then we're supposed to be basically done. So I'd say that the urgency definitely is one of the biggest motivators.
And so am I right in saying you're the youngest minister in the Swedish Parliament at the moment?
Yes.
So with that in mind, what does bold action look like to you?
Well, I've always said that politics can be a lot of different things, and actually I think that there's a common misconception that there's kind of a set schedule when you're a politician or a minister on what you're supposed to do, but you actually have quite a lot of power on what kind of a minister you want to be or what kind of a politician and what you want to focus on. And in that, I see that there's a lot of politicians that might be more interested in taking care of systems, and some that are more prone to changing systems. And I'm very much more prone to creating a shift and creating new opportunities and new reforms and political decision-making. So I'm very much intrigued towards that side of politics, which makes climate a very good topic for me as well.
It does. Would you call yourself a disruptor?
Yes.
Okay.
But I also thought that I would have so much time to be a disruptor in the parliament as a newly elected member of parliament after the election. And then when I got the question to become a minister in cabinet, that was quite a shift, because I was no longer to represent the voters that I had and the people who had voted for me. I was to represent our entire country. And that's kind of a big shift. And it's very difficult to make that shift when you're naturally more of a disruptor to become more of a representative for your entire country.
Absolutely. Now you're within a system. You're not just acting by yourself anymore.
Yes.
So what has surprised you most, really, about being in government and working in climate policy? There are so many layers to uncover. Working in the government, what's really surprised you?
Many things, but I definitely say that one thing that has been surprising, and it's not a cheery topic, so I might kill the mood, but it's the fact that there's kind of a lot of people out there that are maybe saying one thing and doing another, and there's a lot of, specifically in the bigger negotiation rooms, or in the beginning, I was quite shocked to hear how some people spoke outside of a room and how some people spoke inside of that room. And that's a part of politics that I know in some senses is a natural part of how politics works.
Yes,
but
again.
It's kind of harsh to see that so close, on such close hands, so to say.
It must be very hard to see people not practicing what they preach. How do you deal with that personally?
Well, honestly, it's kind of built into the system of politics to that extent that I also need to be in those kinds of situations quite often. I quite often, as a minister, need to represent the result of a negotiation. And whether I like it or not, this is what we could agree on. And this is the farthest we could come. And I also have a principle that is to not let perfect stand in the way of progress. So I need to always challenge myself to not be too intrigued by the vision of a, perfect future where we've made the perfect decision, but to let progress also be an integral part of the transition and what we're trying to do. So in some ways, I also need to stand in rooms and say that this is a good result, this is what we could do, whilst I myself would have wanted so much more.
Right, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And so, we were talking about urgency before. If we get straight into, the environmental strategy in Sweden, so, Sweden's emissions target is to be net zero by 2045. So you're outpacing the EU target there, which is 2050. But you're not as ambitious as Finland, which is 2035. Why is that?
Well, it depends on how you count, but definitely. There's a new Finnish government that has a new goal. They want to accelerate and they want to be better than Sweden. And I find that a good thing, that they're challenging us. But honestly, I think Sweden has come quite far with our climate goals being adopted in 2017, and they're in the middle of being implemented. So to make a shift on when that timing is could possibly also be kind of a disruption to what we're doing. But our goal is actually to reach net zero by 2045 at the latest.
Okay.
And also to have net negative emissions thereafter. And that's kind of an important part as well that I focus quite a lot on policy-wise right now.
Yeah.
How to create that shift towards negative emissions as well. And that's not only CCS, but it's a lot of the carbon sequestration that we can have through our woods and through our forestry. So there's a lot of that going on.
And explain for people who might not understand what carbon negative actually means.
Well, basically, if one is to be correct, one should say net negative, right? Because it's basically if you can be some plus but have a sink that compensates for the plus that you have. So say that you still have some cement production, which is a classic difficult emission to tackle. Then maybe you can compensate for that emission and reach net negative or net zero, which is a classic term being used in Swedish politics. We talk a lot about net zero. So then we need to use our forestry, we need to use carbon capture techniques as well, and try to find these types of technologies that can create a carbon sink to compensate for the emissions that we probably will still have. But we also have innovation when it comes to cement. So I'm getting kind of tired of hanging them out and saying, oh, cement production, the difficulty of gaining net zero there, because maybe they will succeed and maybe they'll even do it in Sweden.
Right, and that's through green cement.
Yes.
Yeah. And so interesting that you talk there about CCS, which is carbon capture and storage, technology, removal solutions for carbon. You know, we're obviously at a tech summit, so I'm sure most people are very pro-tech in this room. Carbon capture and storage is obviously quite a controversial topic. And I think sometimes in my experience, you know, as a journalist covering climate, what I've noticed is that people sometimes look to technology as kind of the panacea, you know, the solution to everything. And yes, we're at a tech conference, but can tech really kind of solve the climate crisis?
I think tech can be an important part of it, but not tech alone. There's a lot of things that needs to be done. And specifically for the example that you raised with carbon capture, it is quite controversial. And the reason for this is that there's a few voices out there, also if I'm to be more precise, also in tech, there's a lot of voices out there that kind of want to see CCS as a solution to not needing to move forward with mitigation work and lowering our emissions the classical way. And then I think that you haven't taken into account how much of a backlog we have with emissions and how much we need to actually progress to actually handle the urgency that we're facing when it comes to climate crisis. So when I speak about CCS, bio-CCS, and all of the developments going on with capturing carbon, it's more a consequence of us being so far away from where we need to be than something that will solve everything in its entirety.
Yeah, so it's part of the system, part of the approach for you.
Yeah.
So, and something that interests me a lot about your government here is that, you know, I understand that since the new government, well, it's not new, 2022, I think you came in, since it came about, the climate portfolio has been absorbed into the Ministry of Business, Industry and Innovation, where before I think it was a separate climate ministry. So does that mean now that the environmental agenda is now more closely tied to economic and business interests? And is that a good thing?
Well, it's almost correct, because we used to have an environment ministry. And the environment ministry would always have arguments with the Ministry of Enterprise. And whenever we'd have files on new politics or new reforms, it always gets stuck between the Ministry of Enterprise and the Ministry of Environment. So we wanted to create a new ministry that was called the Climate and Enterprise Ministry, which is where we work now, both me and the Minister of Energy and Enterprise. So we work collaboratively, and this means that they both, or these both sides of our ministry, they need to agree before putting forward their proposals.
Okay.
And this has created somewhat of a shift within governance. And it's also a matter of, culture, I'd say. Culture within the state. Because us as politicians, we know that there's been sort of a, the Ministry of Environment has not been the heaviest within the system. The heaviest has been the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of those defense, perhaps, or foreign policy and things like that, foreign affairs. So we wanted to create this new ministry that would gain the capacity and the strength that you should have as a viewpoint when looking at climate transition. It should be an integral part of our economic plan, of our foreign affairs plan, and it is now. So I'd say that this shift, of course, created quite a lot of concern because there was a lot of sentimental value tied to Ministry of Environment. But this Ministry of Climate and Enterprise has created a shift in the mindset of what climate action truly is, and this was very important for our government.
And do you think that there could be a conflict of interest there by combining kind of business and climate action so closely?
Definitely. But I think it would be a much bigger problem if you were in a country that's not Sweden. Because in Sweden, truly, transition has been a very integrated part of business policies. And what we're always trying to showcase as well is that Sweden's economy hasn't grown despite of us being in climate transition and lowering our emissions. It has grown because of us lowering our emissions, finding these types of new green solutions to lower our emissions of carbon dioxide, as well as creating new innovative solutions. Take, for example, Volvo and their cars or their trucks. It's not only a matter of eliminating the carbon emissions, it's also a matter of developing the new technologies and modernizing their products. So this has been a very integrated part in business, but not in policy. So there's been like a very difficulty of understanding each other as well. When businesses have arrived to politics, they've wondered, why are you working against each other when you in fact should be working together? So of course, we need to always, as politicians, keep an eye so that it doesn't create a system where business always trumps climate.
Absolutely. I'm glad you've got your eye on them.
No, definitely. And we have, of course, a lot of clashes as well.
Yeah.
But it's important that we resolve those clashes and don't let that result in only slowing down the progress. Because just as I know many of my colleagues here at Techarena, Minister Benjamin Dosa and Minister Jessica Rosenkrantz will mention today, is that we need to make sure to not let the regulation weigh down and slow down climate transition, because that is what we're seeing in our country right now. So this shift in ministry was also an important part of that.
Yeah, it sounds important. And, you know, you were talking there about growth. I think that's something that I'd like to really kind of push you on, because this idea of limitless growth, you know, I was actually at a conference in the UK recently where someone described limitless growth as cancer. Because if you think about it, it's when cells grow endlessly. And so, you know, if we think about the concept of limitless growth within capitalism, isn't that a juxtaposed concept to sustainability within climate?
This is one of my favorite questions, and I discuss it quite frequently with my friends that are also active in climate or in climate politics as well, in other parties. One of the reasons that I chose the Liberal Party to be engaged in as a climate, active youth, it was because of the view on economic growth, because I truly believe that it's a very honorable idea to try and create a different system, but I don't think that that will ever be possible without very big humane capital and painful experience and lacks of opportunities in our lives that would be necessary to create that kind of a shift. So what I'm also so intrigued by, and which makes me a very convicted liberal climate politician, is to capitalism is a very strong system that can truly create quite a lot of growth, whether you think it's cancerous or not. It's a lot of growth in a certain direction. So I believe that we can almost exploit or manipulate the capitalist system to work in our favor when it comes to climate. And when you view how motivating capital and money can be for different types of developments in the world, I think it's quite easy to come to the conclusion that you can create the shift in that system working in favor towards lessening our emissions. But you need to, of course, go into the system then. You can't just back off and wait for something magical to happen. But you need to have, for example, in our country, in Sweden, we've had carbon taxation since 1991. And that has been a very important part of our economic system, shifting towards lowering our emissions, energy efficiency, and so on. And now we're moving forward more with other types of economic shifts, for example, with emissions target, emissions trading systems.
Yes. And so in the current system that we're in, especially in Sweden, do you think that we can move away from the kind of short-term incentive, profit-driven mindset? Because what you're saying is you think that we should harness that and, you know, exploit capitalism. I think that's a great way of putting it, for our benefit. But how do we do that if people are still concerned with short-term growth as opposed to long-term resilience?
You need to find ways of manipulating, not only in, for example, putting a price on carbon and creating a profit margin within the spending of carbon. You need to also find it in so many different aspects of the economic system. So, for example, when it comes to circular economy and creating a system where you need to take into factor, for example, there's probably few companies in Sweden that don't have quite a big value chain with different companies going in and out. If you're shopping something online, you're probably not shopping it from the company itself, you're shopping it through an e-commerce platform. So you need to make sure that it's not that the switches to our system are not dislocated from each other, because then you won't achieve what you're trying to achieve. You need to make sure that they're integrated into each part of our economic system, and then you can actually create that type of a shift. And I think that Sweden is a great example of that. With our carbon taxation, with our introduction of emissions trading systems and other things, we have seen this development where our economy has grown about 100% at the same time as our emissions have lowered about 40%, which is not enough. 40 is not enough, but it's quite a good progression if in comparison to other countries. And Sweden has the lowest emissions per capita in the EU, which is something we're very proud of.
Yeah.
And we want to have that challenge. I'm so glad when you say that Finland, I've heard that Finland wants to go even further than you. That's great.
Well,
let's have that competition.
That's the thing, because on the world stage, from an outsider looking in, Sweden is incredibly impressive on the world stage from a green perspective. But, you know, I'm still hearing that emissions have risen recently with the new right-wing coalition. I've heard things like, you know, some of your approaches have been to do with cutting fuel taxes, both for cars and for planes. So you're making it kind of cheaper to drive and to fly. Is that responsible as a climate minister for you to enact those policies?
It is responsible if you have a macro view of what we're trying to do. It's not responsible, of course, if you look at the micro part, and if you look at the emissions going up, that's nothing any climate minister would be satisfied with. But we've seen that type of a shift in Sweden many times. For example, after economic recessions, we've had a stronger economy and our emissions have grown. After the pandemic, our emission grew, and right now our emissions are growing as well, but it's a consequence or 2024, I should say, which is the year where our emissions grew. 2023, they were lowered again with our government, with our policy. And in 2025, this year, we're expecting them to go down as well because of climate policy adopted by the government. So what happened in 2024? Well, we had quite a relapse, and there was very many scientists that actually pointed out that we might get to there, and let's watch out for that. But we didn't really take that into consideration. Okay. And the problem was that we put a lot of our policy, I'd say about 90% of our climate policy was within creating a price incentive within petrol and petrol prices. And putting so much of the policy in one place makes it quite vulnerable, for example, for elections, where there's a lot of parties, actually all parties in the Swedish parliament except for one, that went to the election with, we're going to lower the petrol prices. So it creates quite a difficult situation where you need to take into consideration what price mechanisms do we have here. For example, we want to have a blending of biofuel with our petrol, but when we see that the liter price of that fuel goes up to amounts that you've never seen before, it creates quite a big shift when it comes to the pump, and it creates a lot of concern and basically populism, where you're trying to say that we'll lower the prices for you, we'll solve this problem for you.
But is that the reason that you cut fuel taxes essentially for affordability? Was that the reason? Well,
we fuel taxed it quite a lot. I'd say that the biggest reason for our emissions growing in 24 was the lessening of the mandatory biofuel mixing of our petrol. And what's interesting is to have a look at the prices now, because as soon as we lower the mandatory level, the prices also also went down. And I'm hoping that they will go down to an extent where we can gradually rise it again without getting those types of economic pressure, where you have an outcome where the demand is much bigger than the production. So
yeah, so you very much take the long-term perspective that kind of it's a price worth paying this year or last year.
It's a result of the, it's a chessboard, you know. I have my players and I have certain moves that I can and can't do.
Yeah.
And focusing this much on the petrol has been something that I've also been concerned with. I've listened to the scientists in Sweden, climate scientists, saying it's kind of a dangerous plan to put it so much in here. And I'm also, you know, we speak a lot about just transition when speaking globally and speaking about how we can get countries with tougher economic situations to transition as well. We also need to take that approach when discussing nationally, because if we have rural areas and areas where there's a lot of population outside of our cities in Sweden as well, you know, we're quite a long Nordic country with a lot of areas that aren't cities, and if they see that climate is something that's threatening my life, it's threatening my freedoms, it's taking away opportunities and choices from me, you will never be invested in it. But if you see that it's something that's modernizing our society, it's creating a bettering of my health, of my environment, that's something that people at most in rural areas are very interested in.
So it's the narrative, it's kind of about changing the narrative so that everyone feels that it affects them and can see how it would benefit them.
Yeah, but I don't think everyone will benefit. There will be people that will be the losers of climate transition, and that's also an important discussion to have. Because if you look at the changes that society has had throughout history, you know what happened during the industrialization, you know what happened during the digitalization. There are going to be jobs that are lost and changes to our society which some might lose on.
Yeah.
But I think it's very important to be aware of the pressure you're putting on certain parts of our society. And I think that that is an awareness that was lacking in the former government, which my party actually supported as well. So we're kind of, you know, the Liberal Party trying to solve Sweden's challenges and working both ways. So I see that there are pros and cons of each side. And this is, of course, the biggest con of the right-wing government.
Does Greta Thunberg like you?
Oh, no, definitely not.
Why not?
Well, I don't think she's understanding what I'm doing. I maybe will stop there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because she's so well known on the world stage now. You know, she's the climate activist and she's Swedish. You seem like a very kind of young, ambitious, green minister. I would hope that you two could be friends and have productive conversations, but it sounds like that hasn't happened yet.
It hasn't happened yet, but one thing that's very funny is that Greta doesn't know that she actually helped me in one of my negotiations.
Okay, say more.
Because it was in the beginning of the Fridays for Future demonstrations outside of the parliament. And I was sitting inside of Parliament trying to make a proposal on climate policy that my party was not so keen on. And I was trying to push for my opinion, and people were, well, they had arguments against, and it was quite a long discussion and negotiation on what my party should decide on this policy. And what I did in the end of it was that I opened the window, and Fridays for Future were walking by, and I said, can you just listen to the amount of concern in these young people's voices, and just please be a bit less narrow-minded. And they actually were. Wow. And I got my small majority for my proposal. And then it was actually pitched into government negotiations, and the former government implemented this policy.
Wow.
So
Greta gave you a helping hand.
Yeah, she gave me a great helping hand.
She did.
And maybe I'll tell that story, and she might gain a bit of understanding for what politicians inside of the system are trying to do, as well as people outside. Because she's so important for climate transition, and I truly appreciate what she has done. It's really remarkable.
Yeah, even though you're coming from different approaches.
Yeah.
So, just last question: if you weren't constrained, you know, by your kind of party coalition, say the Liberals had, you know, a 51% majority, how bold would you go on the climate front?
I would go very bold, but also I would deregulate as much as I would invoke policies. So I think that governments creating climate transition is almost as much being invasive as stepping away and clearing the way of policy, of regulation. So I would say that I would go radical in both directions.
Okay.
And that's what I would do if I had 51%. So I'll get to work to be able to reach that accomplishment.
Well, thank you very much, Romina. Please give her a big round of applause.
Thank you so much for having me.